Good afternoon, everybody. This is Kevin Ring with FAM. Thanks for joining us for another heart-to-heart discussion. Very pleased and sort of humbled today to have with us Clara LeBeau, who is the grandmother of Andrea Highbear, who most people know in the media as Andrea Circlebear, who died tragically a few weeks ago in BOP custody after delivering her baby while on a ventilator. And it's one of those stories that touched people across the country. There have been obviously dozens of deaths in federal prison and in state prisons around the country. This one really shocked people at the idea of why this young woman pregnant was even in prison at this time. And so we're very grateful to Clara to join us so we can talk not just about what happened and how do we avoid this, but also get to know the person behind the headlines, because she was more than just her tragic death. It was a life that should have continued. And so I'm also grateful to Rachel Barkow for joining us. Rachel is a well-known law professor at New York University School of Law. She served previously on the U.S. Sentencing Commission, and she's also the author of an excellent book, Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration, which is a must-read. And so we're going to have her join us to talk about policy implications of this tragic death and what's happening in the BOP overall in terms of home confinement, compassionate release, and whether people are being kept out of harm's way. And so I want to start first by talking to Clara. And Clara, I know you may not be able to join us for the whole time. And so I know you have duties and responsibilities now. And so feel free to leave whenever you have to. And if you haven't unmuted your microphone, please do. I just want to ask you, before we talk about what happened to Andrea, can you just tell us a little bit about her that we're not reading in the papers, about her life and about her, what do we need to know about your granddaughter?
Well, Andrea was a 30-year-old granddaughter. She was my oldest granddaughter, and she was very well-liked, well-respected. She was a good mother to her 5 children, and she had a good personality. She loved everybody, and just a friendly, outgoing person. Caught up in, something that she did wrong, but she really was sorry about it, and made more changes to be a better person. So
Yeah, well, I wanted to tell you that I think I mentioned this before we talked today, which was I'm not a reporter. I'm not asking you questions in that way. And part of the reason we wanted to have you is because we work with thousands of families whose greatest fear is what happened to your family. And already since we've started, the chat has alerted me that everyone is sending their condolences to you and to your family and lifting you up in their thoughts and prayers during this time. I want to ask you, this all happened pretty fast. I don't think people might understand that she was only sentenced in January. And so can you sort of walk us through, what that process was like, when you knew she was gotten in trouble, and what you thought was going to happen, what did she think was going to happen, and how that played out?
okay, we knew that she was going to be sent away to a prison unknown to us. We knew that it was going to be a medical facility, and we just waited for that to happen. And I didn't, I knew while she's being pregnant, we had talked about it, about her being sent away. She was in a county jail awaiting to be sent, and they wouldn't tell her where she was going to be sent, or neither did I know. But while she waited in the county jail, she was seeing a doctor for her pregnancy. And of course, this was going to be her 6th pregnancy that she was going to have a cesarean. She was considered high risk because of all her other pregnancies. and she was seeing the doctor in the county jail, and the nurses, or not the nurses, but the feds, she told me that asked the nurses if she was able to fly, and the nurses told the feds that she was able to fly. So she did share that with me, and our concern was, being that she was pregnant, why would they want to take her when she was seeing a local doctor there and close to the facility where she's had her other cesareans. So that was a concern for us, but seemed like we just didn't or are not able to do anything about it. And that was one of the main reasons why, she had called to let me know about it. And she did tell them that she was high risk being pregnant, and they just didn't, pay attention to that. So then the next thing I knew, she had, I didn't hear from her for a while. And then I knew that they must have taken her. She did call when she arrived at Carswell prison, and she said she was going to be there for 14 days in quarantine there, but she didn't tell me that she was sick or anything. And so I didn't expect her being sick either. Is very, we were very sorry to hear that she was going to be, probably kept isolated and everything. And I felt bad about it because she said it'd be 14 days and then another week before she could, have contact or maybe have privileges. So looking at 3 weeks being isolated was really concerning to me. And later on, she was, from what I had heard from the news, is that she was taken from the prison to the hospital on a Saturday, and apparently seen there, but they sent her back to the prison. And then later, the next time she called me, she was there. They were admitting her there at the hospital there at Fort Worth. And the doctor there was kind of concerned about who I was, or if I was the right person who would be taking her baby. And but Andrea did say she had pneumonia, and I believe that's all she had. She never had any other underlying medical conditions, with her. And anyway, we didn't chat very long with the doctor, and I was just thinking it was, she's going to be taken care of within the pneumonia, and then eventually, down the road would have her baby, and not thinking that that's what they were going to do, is have the cesarean that night that happened. And the next day, the doctor called me, or I got a call from somebody there, and they said she was on a ventilator and had her cesarean. I was shocked. I asked them, why did they let me know about it? And we spoke for a little while there. The doctor gave the phone over to Andrea, and I spoke with her. She was very concerned about her children. I told her not to worry about them. They were well taken care of. And, she said to tell them that she loved them. And she told me she was afraid. And I told her, I tried to encourage her not to be afraid and to pray. And is my faith to pray and look to God for answers. And this was a time that that I prayed with her, and that was the last time that I talked to her.
When was that in relation to when she ultimately passed? Was that?
That was, oh gosh, she had called me probably the last day of March, and then she had her baby April 1st. And she'd been on a ventilator since then till April 28th when she passed.
And what did you hear anything from after the last time you talked to her? Did you hear anything from either the hospital or the Bureau of Prisons? Like, were you getting updates on her status?
Not from the Bureau of Prisons. They hadn't called me at all to even let me know she was sick or that they were sending her to the hospital. Or I haven't heard from them at all at that point. And I told the doctor there that I'd like to be kept updated on her condition daily. And it was a couple days later, then they start calling me and keeping me posted on her condition.
Were you able to see her when she was at I think it was the Winter City Jail, when she was in South Dakota? Was family able to visit her there?
I guess they did have visitation hours, but we never made it down there. We talked about going down there, but it was just too late. They had already transferred her. So
I think you had mentioned this, but was there any effort she was transferred from the jail to Carswell, I think on like March 20th, I think. Do you know why in the middle of the pandemic they would have sent her to the prison as opposed to like sending her home? Did anyone talk about that?
That's probably what they should have done, but like I said, as prison has their laws or the federal prisons have their laws and everything, and what she was sentenced to, I just felt that, it was just hopeless to even try, and there was really nothing I could do about it.
Yeah, no, I understand that must have been how you felt. And how did you, like, what was her feeling about flying to Carswell? I mean, did she think, okay, it's a medical hospital, maybe that's better? Or what, or did she think, I don't want to go there? What were you all thinking?
Yeah, she didn't really want to go there. And I didn't want her to go there either. I thought she should stay in South Dakota and have her baby. And she felt the same way. But they said it was okay for her to fly, and didn't hear from her a few days after that. And they had sent her down to Carswell.
Have you heard about the whistleblower who's come forward, who's the head of the corrections officers union at Carswell, who has said that, a number of officers had come in contact with her before she was exhibiting symptoms and they weren't wearing PPE, and, the reason I say this is because there's so much talk. The Attorney General of the United States has said for a lot of people, prison is the safest place to be. And I think it's so clear that's not true. And it certainly was not a place for an 8-month pregnant woman. But it's not safe for the guards as well. And so the guards were sort of raising the issue in this whistleblower complaint that, they didn't know she was symptomatic. They didn't have, protective gear. Have you seen that or heard about that?
It wasn't till way afterwards I had heard about it, and where the whistleblower had come and reported conditions there at the prison. I didn't know at the time when she was sent there, didn't know anything about the prison until then, after I heard it on the news.
And then so then Andrea talks to you. She's given birth. They've done a C-section, and then what happens with the baby? I mean, what did the Bureau say to you, and how do you take custody there?
Like I said, the Bureau of Prisons never did call me or let me know anything about what was going to happen. It was the hospital that I was in contact with, and they kept me informed about the baby, how she was doing every day, and that they knew that Andrea wanted to name her, and that she wanted me to, take care of her until she got out. And so the hospital just kept me informed every day about her conditions until she was discharged on April, I believe April 19th. And my daughter and I and granddaughter went down. We drove down after the baby. and picked her up and brought her home.
When you went and picked up the baby, were you allowed to see Andrea?
No, I wasn't able to see her. I had talked to her doctor at one point, telling her that I'd like to see her when I go down after the baby. And she thought maybe there'd be some way that I could through the window or something. That was all that was said. And then as time got closer, I called and again to confirm, could I, see the baby or see Andrea? And the doctor at that time told me that I couldn't see her because she was an inmate and they have their own laws that they don't have visitors or anything. And I was saddened to know that the distance I was going to be driving down to get the baby, I wasn't able to see my granddaughter. But it was later on when I finally was able to do a video chat with her. And that was just for a short time because I just couldn't handle it. And I did speak to her and then told her to wake up and called her by name and told her I was there. But that was all I could say to her. And later on, as I got a little stronger, well, then I asked the doctor if I could talk to her, at least, put the phone up to her ear. And that eventually happened. So I was able to talk to her by phone.
I can't imagine your grief. I'm so sorry. How are you holding up? I mean, how are you getting through this? She has 5 children that you're now taking care of, and if I'm right, no one's older than 10. And does the oldest? What do they know, or what have you said about their mom?
I haven't really been able to visit the children. They're with a grandfather who lives next door to me, and I'm holding up pretty much. Without the Lord in my life, it would have been much harder. But I, pray a lot and look for guidance and that comfort that I get. The oldest daughter she's 10 years old. I believe she understands and she knew about her mother. I know she took it hard. But like I said, I haven't really seen her. She has 2 other babies that are in Pampers. One's a year old and the other is 2 years old. And of course, she has the newborn. So we have 3 babies. The other kids, they're too young to really know what's going on. So, but eventually, we will tell them.
I think you mentioned to me before that when last time you talked to Andrea, she said to pray for her. And was that something that she found comfort into as well as her Christian faith, or?
Oh yes, definitely. When she was at the hospital, she did mention to me that she was calling for help for 4 days and they ignored her. And she told them at least call my grandmother so she can pray, And she said they just totally ignored her. So. And they never did, like I said, they never did report to me anything at all. It wasn't until some warden had sent me a letter afterwards, and it was just that they were taking care of her body, and until till her body got to South Dakota, and then he just sent his condolences in that letter. So that was the only time that I ever received anything or any acknowledgement from the Bureau of Prisons.
And were you able last week to have a memorial service?
Yes, on Thursday, the May 7th, we were able to bury her. It was limited to family only because of the COVID-19 issue that is going about. And so it was just a private family um, funeral services, although it was live streamed. The funeral home did that. Um, but there was a lot of people that was in the procession out to the funeral. And it was just like maybe 2 miles from town where the cemetery was. And there was quite a few people there out in the open at the cemetery.
Rachel, I'm going to bring you in to talk about some of the, how this happens. I just want to say that, at FAM, we work with thousands of families, some of whom have gone through losing a loved one in custody. I'm never not shocked by what feels like the inhumanity and cruelty of the bureaucracy in dealing with the families, sometimes not getting a body back, not being informed when the person's going to the hospital. But Claire, how do you make sense of this? I mean, do you look at this, I mean, as somebody, I mean, you obviously had this special relationship with your granddaughter, and so I'm sure you count that as a blessing. And you're a strong woman who's obviously able to help. How can people support you? How are you finding support? I mean, is your family coming together? I mean, I think people know this, that we've started a GoFundMe page. I mean, we want to be able to provide financial support, but like, how do you get through this, and where do you find strength right now?
It's through prayer, but what helps is I have brothers and sisters that have been really supportive from the time she went into the hospital, or even before when she was in prison. We would gather and pray, and so that was my support from my family. Other than her having the 6 children, I appreciate the GoFundMe, because there's needs that they have, and having to support 3 babies, that's gonna take a toll. But I don't mind, taking care of my great grandchildren. I love them very much, and I know this is the right thing to do, is just take care of them. And like I said, I appreciate all your help, your organization, and I thank you very much for that.
That's the least we can do. How is the baby doing?
She's doing very well. She likes to eat. She was premature, like maybe like a month or so, and a month early, I should say. And at one time, she had some problems at the hospital with her feeding. They did insert a feeding tube, but then, that she overcame that. And right now she loves to eat.
And what was her name that Andrea picked
Her
up?
name is Alicia Elizabeth Ann Highbear.
And what is the significance of that name? Is there any?
Andrea picked the name way before she knew she was going to have a little girl. And she named her that. I believe she said she got part of that from the Bible, but Elizabeth Ann is 2 of her sisters that she had lost tragically the last probably 3 years now. And they were just younger than her. They were all very close. And she named her baby after her sisters.
Yeah, and I'm aware that your family has suffered tragedy before, and I can't even imagine how you get through this. Rachel, I was sitting in this chair at this desk on April 28th, and I remember when the press release was issued, and I got it and shared it with our team and with our Facebook group and families, and everyone was immediately, I thought, torn apart in a way that I hadn't. I mean, you get a lot of bad news working on these issues, but this one really struck home for a lot of people, and immediately lifting up Clara and the family in prayer. How does this happen? I mean, I mean, what is wrong with our system? I mean, not that you're responsible, but from sitting on the Sentencing Commission, studying it as you have, what in the world, how do we get these results?
You know, I think the Bureau of Prisons is broken. I mean, truly, I think it's a broken organization. And I think this tragedy just illustrates it for you. I think the people who work there, you know, I'm not going to assume there's any kind of malicious intent or bad intent, but as a bureaucratic structure, it is just broken. It can't accomplish really any of the things it's supposed to do. And if you think about the response to this crisis, you just see it everywhere. You know, you just have to ask yourself, what functioning organization would take a woman who's 8 months pregnant and make her fly on a plane to Texas from South Dakota, and knowing that this virus is out there? I mean, it's hard to imagine, you know, the layers of, frankly, ignorance and neglect that would have to take place for that to happen. And then when you add on top of it, just the lack of concern for humanity, you know, how they're not contacting Clara and letting her know what's happening. And I've heard stories like that all over the country, where people say they're getting no reports about what's going on with their loved ones who are incarcerated. You know, basic communication, they're failing in that. So they're failing to protect the people who are in their custody, that they have a constitutional obligation to protect. They are failing to protect their staff and the people who work there. They don't have the PPE that they need to stay safe. There's no social distancing. They're failing to communicate with the families and loved ones. They're failing to carry out the Attorney General's order to get people out, put them in home confinement. And, you know, I wish this was aberrational, but this is business as usual for the BOP. When I was at the Sentencing Commission, one of the things we studied was compassionate release, which kind of brings up some of these same issues, because it's not new to the Bureau of Prisons to have people in their custody who get sick, and who get very sick. And there is a statutory system in place that would allow people to petition to the Bureau of Prisons for release when that happens, for compassionate release. And, you know, that was the subject of 2 Inspector General reports, and we at the Commission studied it as well. And basically, the Bureau of Prisons didn't grant anyone compassionate release. They weren't even ruling on people's motions in time. People would just die. And that kind of level of neglect was so awful that even Congress, which, as you know, is not super quick to act to oversee prisons, did something about it and said, well, we can't make you go through the Bureau of Prisons anymore to get compassionate release. We're going to let people go immediately to court after, 30 days if they haven't heard, because of this. And so I think you're just seeing it all play out in the most horrible circumstances of a pandemic, that this is an organization that does not work from top to bottom, from its leadership to the people who are inside facilities. And, I wish it were otherwise, but at this point, if you were grading it, you'd have to give BOP an F. It's horrific.
Well, the thing we have been concerned about is there's no oversight. And so, there's no accountability when you don't have oversight. So things like this happen. And we immediately called for an investigation because real people made decisions that created this tragedy. I mean, there were people at each step of the way who had authority to do something differently and instead said, I'm just doing my job. I'm passing her here. I'm sending her there. And no one said, what in the world are we doing with an 8-month-old pregnant woman who's sick, putting her in this prison? And the one thing is we've been lobbying for, safe releases, get vulnerable people out of prison through compassionate release, home confinement, and the rest. I have not found that the governors have been that receptive at the state level. The federal government's doing a little bit, but slow. But in lieu of releases, we've been trying to get them at least to communicate to families. Because at the federal system, everyone is tuned into that 3:00 BOP announcement to see what the latest count is for positive test results. They don't even believe those results, but at least they're looking at that. But they're not communicating so that people, their loved ones are going to hospitals. They're not finding out about it until they're already there. Other people have died without their families knowing. I just want to ask, Claire, what would have been helpful to you through this? I mean, from start to begin, I mean, you've mentioned you had little contact. But I mean, how often total did you hear from the BOP from the time she got down to Carswell until the time you went to pick up the baby?
Yeah, like I said, they haven't contacted me at all. Um, I wished I would have known something, as to what was going on, but I had read it in or heard the news about her, getting sick. But I also remember when one of our conversations was that she was uh, outside in a cold. They were getting ready to board the plane, and it was so cold that she didn't, have a jacket or anything. And I believe that's where the sickness started. And I believe, like she said, they told her that she had pneumonia, and I believe that. And with our South Dakota weather, it can get really cold. And I even at that, when she was, crying out for help, I know they had failed her, but even if they would have let me know that, she was being sick and taken to the ER there at the hospital, that would have been some help. At least I would have known um, about this, and not till I read it or heard it on the news was pretty bad when they weren't really keeping me informed at all.
Were you able to talk to her when she was in quarantine?
Just when she arrived there, she did say that she was going to be in quarantine for 14 days, and but she didn't say she was sick or anything. And we just thought that it's probably the policy for them when they get there, they're quarantined. But she didn't at all say she was sick or anything at that time.
Yeah. Um, when we do these, just so you know, we invite people to submit questions so that I can ask you. And I just want to reiterate, Clara, that everyone is holding you up in prayer and wishing the best for your family. And I know if the baby wakes, you have to go take care of your granddaughter, but stay with us as long as you can. But I understand that if you go, that's why you have to go. Um, this is going to be an impossible question, perhaps, Rachel, but it's like, what can families do? I mean, how do you force this bureaucracy to give information? I mean, what can they do? I mean, because I know some of these families, they'll call wardens all day, every day. They don't get calls back. The case managers don't want to talk to them. They don't know if they have to hire lawyers to do this stuff. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's a tough one.
I wish I had the answer. I mean, I do think that, there were members of Congress who were absolutely horrified by the fact that people were dying without their compassionate release motions getting resolved. And it led them to pass the legislation. And I think it's stories like this one that will move Congress to do more. And so I would say, in addition to calling, the local prison officials, the warden where your loved one is being incarcerated, to call your senators and call your representatives,
Yeah.
and call the Department of Justice, because the other way to think about this case, so it was certainly a BOP failure, but you also just have to ask yourself about the judgment of the prosecutor in this case to seek incarceration, to do that with someone who's 8 months pregnant on a drug charge. I mean, there's layers of this that one could really ask about. But I think the Department of Justice, which is where the Bureau of Prisons is housed, is another place to demand that more be done. And certainly to congressional representatives and overseers, and really, I would say, to the extent you can get people in the media to tell these stories and get the stories out there, I think, anyone with a heart who hears this, it's devastating, the lack of concern for humanity, and thinking about taking a mom who already has 5 children, small children, and putting her through this while pregnant with a 6. I mean, you just have to ask yourself where we've come as a society that this is taking place at all. And so I think getting these stories out there, the more people hear about them, the more the public hears about them, I think it becomes harder for them to turn a blind eye to what's happening in our prisons. I do think there's unfortunately a kind of apathy that large segments of the public have. they think, oh, you shouldn't have committed the crime then, and so whatever happens to you after that is what happens. And I think it's because they're not really thinking about the people that we're talking about, that there's so much more than whatever they might have been charged with. And they have families and they have loved ones and they're good people who maybe made mistakes, but we have a common humanity. And I think when the stories start to be told at a wider scale, people will change their minds. And I think that includes the people who we elect to represent us. I really do believe that if there's more pressure put on Congress to really listen, that they could do something about it. Because I agree with you and FAM that it's outrageous that there is not oversight of this enormous government program that is basically a colossal failure and inhumane, and they answer to nobody. And that really should stop.
Well, and one thing we didn't mention, I mean, which makes the story even worse, is that she had a 26-month sentence, Andrea did, and the judge had recommended her for the residential drug treatment program. So she was only going to spend, with good time, a year in prison. And so for that, we subjected her to this. Now, I mean, no one should have to die in prison, sort of in my view, especially if they don't have a life sentence, but certainly if they're only supposed to go for a year and somehow that gets lost in the equation. Claire, I don't expect you to figure out what good comes from this because your family has bore the brunt of this. But from your perspective, I mean, would you say if you had, President Trump or the United States Senate right in front of you, what changes would you tell them to make? I mean, do you see any reason why a pregnant woman should almost ever be in prison? I mean, what lessons do you draw from this that are bigger than the tragedy that befell your family?
Yeah, I believe what Rachel had said really brought forth the important issues that families, or especially my family, has gone through with Andrea. And I think that's very important that it be known to the legislators and the president and whoever makes these decisions and laws, that would take into consideration all that has gone on.
Have you heard from any of your representatives, Claire?
No, I haven't. I haven't heard from anybody.
Yeah. Rachel, this comes on a day where the president's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, has just been released on the home confinement. And I think in a vacuum, people would say, 71-year-old people who have pre-existing conditions during a pandemic, prison isn't a good place for them. So, fine, get them out of harm's way and put them on home confinement. That's a sufficient way of holding him accountable. But the juxtaposition between sort of what happens to regular people, and even if it seems unfair, it's how it feels to people, families who feel powerless against this bureaucracy. And I'm sure, and I don't begrudge him, that Mr. Manafort had an attorney who was well paid and fought on his behalf. So it's just like at every step of the system, people feel disadvantaged as they try to fight this monster. And then even when they get to prison, Clara said herself, it's like, had they known, maybe they could have fought harder to keep her at the jail or got her to home confinement. I should say that in the Attorney General's memo, I think it's the April 3rd memo, he says that all pregnant women are being moved either to home confinement or to these MINT programs, which is they keep mothers and newborn children together. Well, that's great, but they didn't get Andrea. And so, it just feels like unless you have a loved one advocating for you 24/7, there's just two sets of rules. And that really is hard for people to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for anyone to. It's hard for me to understand. It's that kind of most grotesque inequality that is hard for anyone to stomach, right? We should have equal justice under law. We should be treating all these people equally. And I'd like everybody to be treated like Paul Manafort. It's not to say he should be put on a plane to a facility and his loved ones shouldn't be contacted with his health updates and he should be left to die. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But Andrea should have been given the same benefits that he's been given, and her family should have been treated the same way his family is being treated, with respect and communication and updates. And, it starts to Everywhere you look now, whether it's the Flynn case, the Stone case, the Manafort case, right? It's hard to see these cases and know that while they are actually pointing out some things in our justice system that are awful, those things happen every day to thousands and thousands of people. And when it happens to regular people, nobody bats an eye and no one cares. And it's only because these are friends of the president that any attention is paid to their case, or so it seems. And you can't have a justice system that is going to be viewed as legitimate in the eyes of the public if you do that. I think I would hope that the Department of Justice recognizes how awful this is for its mission, because you will not have a country that respects the department and what it's doing if it looks like it is favoring political allies and treating everybody else like dirt. That's just not how you get respect for the rule of law by anyone. And if you don't have respect for the rule of law, you're not going to get the public safety and functioning government that you want. So they really need to urgently fix this, even if they weren't going to do it as a matter of humanity, which you'd hope they would. There's a real just kind of basic utilitarian calculus that they should be making here, which is that they will not achieve any of the goals they have for public health and safety unless they get on top of this. And, that's the other aspect of this, is that when you have the spread of this virus inside these facilities, it doesn't stay there. It goes in and out with the staff, and they bring it to their communities. And we see that all over the country. And so the idea of not thinking about protecting people who are inside and turning a blind eye to what's happening there, even if you didn't care about it just as a matter of basic humanity, then at least care about it from the perspective of this is going to happen inside the communities that these facilities reside in. I mean, we've seen it all over the country. You can see maps where if you look at hotspots of where the virus is spreading, you see amazing overlap with places that have prisons, because once it spreads inside there, it leaves at the end of the day with the staff and it starts going into the surrounding community. And these are not communities that have the hospitalization and medical care that they need to address all this. So, that's where I guess I come back to the fact this is clearly a failed bureaucracy, because from whatever it is they're trying to do, they're failing. They're failing at their mission of safety. They're failing at their mission of health. They're failing at their mission of protecting the people in their custody. And they're basically failing at the most basic human communication efforts and treating people with any kind of dignity. They're just failing at everything. And you would have hoped by now we'd have better leadership in place to try to just get control of this. But, I don't see that anywhere. I don't see it from the AG. I don't see it from the acting head of BOP. I just, no one is taking command of this situation.
Well, and there seems to be a disconnect, sort of FAM's theory of change is that by telling these stories, and that's why we're so grateful for Clara at this time to share Andrea's story, is because I know it's not easy, but we have thousands of families who share their story with the hope that people recognize that people who are in prison and jail are somebody's mothers and granddaughters and loved ones. There's times where I can be cynical about that, and I know even talking to Rhonda, Andrea's aunt, who said, sometimes I read the comments in the story. I mean, this is one of the most compelling stories and heartbreaking stories you can find. And people will still say, well, you should, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. And I do think there's a sense even with lawmakers that, even if you look at what's happening right now across the country, private businesses are being closed at gunpoint. We're closing beaches, businesses, everyone's being kept in their home. But there's no sort of emergency analog taking place in the prisons. We think giving out masks and giving people soap is some great protection, even though people are on top of each other, and the disease is spreading like hotcakes. And it's like, how does you were in a position of public trust as a commissioner and stuff. How does that get through? I mean, short of sharing these stories, I don't find that reciting statistics about people's reoffense rates and things like that really affect people. But short of these people telling their stories, like what more can people do? What gets through to people? I agree with you that there's a empathy gap there or something, but I think it's as long as they think that these are other people, and that even somebody like Andrea is, well, shouldn't have sold drugs and done what you did. There's just this gap there, and that's what we have to overcome. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the irony of mass incarceration is that because we have incarcerated so many people in the United States, we have so many people with justice involvement. I think it's going to be the seeds of its own demise, because we now have so many people with personal interactions, either because they themselves were incarcerated or a loved one or someone very close to them has been. And as soon as you see this firsthand, it doesn't take much. You just, as soon as you see it firsthand, you're not writing a comment like, well, then you shouldn't have done the crime, right? Like, no one who has even a passing familiarity with who is incarcerated, their backstories, their lives, what it looks like when someone's incarcerated, would say that. Like, that's a comment that comes out of complete and total ignorance. And so as soon as people get close to this problem, as soon as people see it firsthand, you get the urgency that it needs to be fixed. And I do think there is a growing army of people out there, sadly, with that personal experience. But, that's the group to mobilize to bring about change. And it's not a small number. And, there's glaring disparities in this. It's people of color are disproportionately affected by this. There's clearly racial justice implications. So, it's also a question of thinking about this in terms of racial justice, and a movement associated with that is attached to it. So I do think we're seeing more attention to this. So, if we were going to look for the kind of glimmers of hope, who would have thought you'd see a Super Bowl ad by President Trump? He had one ad and he could pick anything about his record to highlight. And he highlighted that he released Alice Marie Johnson from prison, right? Which means he made the political calculus that was a winning issue for him and he should highlight it. And the Democratic platforms of the presidential candidates all talked about criminal justice. Joe Biden today released a kind of task force group, and one of them is dedicated to criminal justice. The issue is starting to gain some momentum, and I don't think it's gaining momentum because these people, have necessarily had, a real deep personal conversion necessarily. I think they're making a naked political calculation that we have enough voters that care about this that I can't ignore it anymore. And so then the question is just what items come on that agenda? What are people focused on? And I think it's really important to get conditions in prison and how people are treated when they're incarcerated as one of those issues. I think sentencing has been on there for a while now, long sentences. People are kind of attuned to that. But I think, and my hope is that out of this awful tragedy, one of the things people pay attention to is just how abysmal prison conditions are. And again, I think for two reasons, right? One, your kind of basic decency and how you treat other people. But, I kind of go for, even if you don't have that, 95% of the people who are incarcerated are coming back out. And so don't you want to know when they come back out that while they were incarcerated, things were done to help make them, when they come back out, more likely to be successful, more likely to reintegrate with no problems without committing additional crimes. And because we don't do any of that, I think it's a ripe area for people to be active around and to demand change for. And I think that's my hope. If I try to find any kind of silver lining in this, I think as people learn how horrible prisons are, how unsanitary, how the medical care is just not up to the task of the people who are there, how crowded they are, the callousness with which people are treated, I think we're going to see all of this out in the open now. And the hope is that maybe it'll be a catalyst for change.
Yeah, we've been pushing for oversight. We've seen a couple states adopt it, and it has two functions. It not only oversees prison officials, but it plays sort of a customer service role for the families where they can take the complaints. So there's somebody to call that can investigate things without fear of repercussions, because a lot of families worry that if they complain, it's going to be taken out on their loved one. Claire, I want to ask you, because Rachel brought up the idea about exposure to the system maybe changing our view or informing our view. I went to prison, and that certainly the whole experience of being prosecuted and going changed my views. I mean, how much did you think about the criminal justice system before this, and what has it made you think, either the same or differently, or I don't know how much exposure your family's had to this.
Well, it was some new exposure for me with Andrea's situation, and as it's progressed, the failure really began initially at home with the would say the treatment centers we have, I think that failed her from the beginning. So all the way through from that time on up to her death, they failed her. And it's got to be a lot better than this, for other families. There's got to be some changes made. And hopefully, with this story of my granddaughter's tragic death, I hope this brings to light to everybody that's going to be involved in making those changes.
Yeah, I don't, we had, a family had asked for an investigation into this, and I certainly would like to see some accountability, but I would much rather have an Andrea Circle Bear Act passed that imposed, independent oversight of our federal prisons. So if there's any federal lawmakers, any senators or congressmen watching, we have a bill for you, and we have a cause that's worthy of your time. And, if we're going to prevent this thing, it's not going to be doing the same thing we always do. And as much as Congress, wants to conduct oversight, or they say they do, it's too big of a task. I know that the Inspector General is investigating right now. And Rachel, somebody asked, what do you think about contacting the Inspector General about complaints that people have? Apart from Clara's, but just there's a lot. From food to other conditions to lack of communication. Is that a place to go?
Oh, I think so. I will say that I do think that the Inspector General's reports on compassionate release laid the groundwork for Congress changing the law on that. The Inspector General does a very good job detailing things that are wrong. So if we're looking at facilities right now that are on, 24-hour lockdown and insufficient nutrition and no contact with loved ones, all the things we're hearing about, having the Inspector General investigate that and issue a report on it could be tremendously valuable for getting legislative change. I'm not as familiar with how items get on the IG's agenda. So I don't know how much it matters if people call, but I can't imagine that it hurts.
Yeah.
So I would absolutely try to get this on the Inspector General's radar screen, because I think that office has done a very good job highlighting things that are wrong with BOP. Now, the sad part was the Inspector General had these reports, and frankly, BOP didn't do anything different in response, which is, I think, why we do need that kind of outside independent actor, because even being publicly shamed in reports that said, you've gotten hundreds of these petitions and you don't act on them before the people die in your custody. BOP was still unapologetic and said, oh no, we're doing a good job. They came and they testified before the Sentencing Commission. And, you would think that there was no apology. There was no acknowledgement there was a problem. It was a very defensive posture. I'm sure there's a rich psychological literature to explain why they have to have that point of view, to just avoid the cognitive dissonance of owning up to some of this might just be too tough to take. But that's all the reason why there needs to be an outside entity. And I think having Inspector General reports, getting all this out there, this is what moves Congress to do something. And if, Congress moves, they can create the oversight that BOP needs, because I'm very doubtful we'll get change from within. I just think it's too broken of an institution. And if you want real fundamental change, it's going to have to come from the outside. It's certainly not going to come from BOP or the larger Department of Justice, I don't think.
Yeah. Claire, I'm assuming you're going to have to leave shortly. And so I just want to give you a chance to say something to close. I just want to let people know that, we are focused on making systemic change to the system, both sentencing and prison reform at the federal and state level. And, we're not in a position to help every family. I personally, after talking to you and realizing your needs, we had started a GoFundMe page. And if people are in a position to help, I would urge them to consider that, because I know you have 5 children that you're now going to be taking care of. And I just want to thank you again for taking time to join us. I know you are busy, and I know your family is still grieving. Thank you for sharing your story. I say that to everybody who does. As Rachel said, so many people have been affected by this, but sometimes there's a lot of shame and stigma and hurt, and people don't want to relive their worst moment. And so they're not dying to go talk publicly about what's happened to them. And so and so people maybe don't think the problem is as big as it is. And so by sharing your story, I mean, I hope it's helpful to you, but just please know that is helpful to us and others who are trying to change a broken system. So with that, I want to just say thank you and ask you if you want to share anything else, either about Andrea or about what you're thinking and feeling.
Well, at first, when I heard about your organization, I was kind of hesitant, as well as all the other calls I've been receiving from different reporters throughout the nation. And but I really want to thank you for this opportunity to do this. This is the very first time that I've ever been on doing a Facebook section here, and so it's all new to me, but I appreciate your help and Rachel's, and with all those families out there. I just hope that and pray that they'll be strong and help their loved ones that do need help as an inmate somewhere. And I just appreciate all of you, and thank you, and God bless all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Rachel, do you want to say anything?
Just thank you for letting me be part of this conversation, and Clara, my deepest heartfelt condolences and also my thanks. So I admire your bravery so much for doing this today. And I know it's hard in the moment to appreciate it, but it really is stories like yours and your bravery that changes the world. Because I can come out with all the statistics and it doesn't ever move people. It's only hearing from people as kind and loving as yourself to just put a human face on this awful tragedy. So thank you. That's really all I had. Thanks for including me, Kevin, in this really important conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks for your input. This is the GoFundMe page. If people, you can find it pretty easily. And we appreciate anybody who can contribute. I also want to say, this was more of a heartfelt chance to get to know more about Andrea and their family story. Tomorrow, we're going to get back at advocacy. I hope people are motivated by this story and others to change the laws and the systems that are creating these tragedies. So tomorrow, I'm really happy that Van Jones, who is the CEO of Reform Alliance, but people may know him better from his work on CNN. He's also an author. He's a fantastic advocate. And Sean Hopwood, who is a member of FAM's board, spent time in federal prison, has an incredible story that was covered on 60 Minutes. Now he's a law professor at Georgetown University. They're two phenomenal advocates, and I'm grateful that they'll be joining us tomorrow. And we'll talk about ways to change this broken system. So thanks again to Rachel. Thanks to Clara. Thanks to my team. And we'll talk to you all shortly.